Test, test, test. Unmute mics. Mics are muted.
Good to go. Excellent. Well, I'll call the meeting to order at 10:03. And I'd first like to acknowledge the District of Tofino operates within the territory of the Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation, and we are thankful for that. Also a notice to the attendees that the meeting is being video recorded and will be published on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. And a notice to the virtual attendees to sign up for public comment and question period using the Q&A function in Zoom. To register, participants are required to enter their full name, residential address, and the agenda item they wish to speak to. I will move from the chair that pursuant to section 15 of the District of Tofino Meeting Procedures Bylaw number 1229 2016 as amended, the May 23rd, 2024 special committee of the whole meeting be held electronically via Zoom and live broadcasted on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel, and that the facility provided for the public to watch and hear the meeting be located at Municipal Hall, 380 Campbell Street in Tofino, British Columbia. Thank you, Councillor Sawyer. All those in favor? Excellent. Motion carried. I will move from the chair that the May 23rd, 2024 special committee of the whole agenda be adopted. Thank you, Councillor Sawyer. All those in favor? And once again, I will move from the chair adoption of the minutes that the minutes of the committee of the whole meeting held April 29th, 2024 be adopted. Thank you, Councillor Snowman. All those in favor? Seeing none, opposed, motion carried. That brings us into potentially public comment on agenda items, and I will look over to Keegan as I see him nodding his head.
Thank you, Councillor Stere. I will now do an open call for all members here in the gallery and on Zoom to make public comment. If you wish to do so, you can state your name, the agenda item you are speaking to, and your address. I'll now do an open call going once, going twice, going 3 times. There are currently no members wishing to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Keegan. We don't have any delegations that are on my agenda, no correspondence that I can see, so we can move right into presentation and reports. 8.1 limits to growth discussion report for infrastructure and public works. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. And this will just be a moment.
Good morning, Committee of the Whole, Mayor and Council. Today I'll be presenting on limits to growth. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to take a quick second to think about how long it's actually taken us to get here. So I think this is something that we've been thinking about for almost as long as I've been at the district, so about 10 years. And what today's presentation is intended to do is to set us up for our process over the next couple of months. To try to put some boundaries around our growth as outlined in our official community plan. So I'm really excited to be presenting today. I think this format, the whole would be great. There are some questions that need to be answered and probably a conversation that needs to happen. So having the committee process versus the council process, I think will help with that. So I will speak at you for about 10 or 15 minutes here. But my hope is that we can have a discussion between yourselves and ourselves as staff, because there are some questions that need to be answered. This plan came out of this process came out of the water master plan, which was introduced to council in February, and at that time we had some next steps, and one of those next steps was to get working on a limits to growth policy, and that's why we're here today. This conversation will likely end up, whether today or in the next couple of months, talking a lot about risk management and our tolerance for risk as a community. And again, the end goal here is to provide transparency to current residents, future developers, yourselves, ourselves, and residents of Tofino in terms of what we're looking to do as a community in terms of growth over the next 5 to 10 years. To start with, and then reflected in the report, there's 2 main policy alternatives that we're going to need to talk about. And again, I'll go through the presentation and we can come back to this. But the 2 main policy considerations will be, one, whether we're going to restrict all growth until such time as we've addressed the water capacity deficit. That would mean denying building permits and providing direction to all future development processes, such as development permits or temporary use permits or zoning, and allow people to know what we're doing. This consideration is based on the data generated from the maximum day demand, which again, for council's information and community information, maximum day demand is a demand based on the highest use in a certain time period. So the maximum day demand is based on the highest one-day use of water in Tofino. And so by nature is a very conservative number. So that's the first consideration. That's something we may come back to through the second consideration, but just wanted to say we have this option to cease development as of today. We already are denying building permits and adding covenants to properties in the between the time we are now and the time this policy is adopted. Second consideration is exploring a possibility of limited growth related to housing. Why housing? Why not something else? It's because that's what our official community plan tells us that we should be concentrating on. We all know that we're in a bit of a housing crisis at this time and likely into the future as well. This consideration is based on average day demand. Now, average day demand is a calculation based on what we actually have used over the last 10 or so years during Q3. And so it's not a conservative number, but it is based in real numbers. And so what we're going to talk about hopefully today and in the next couple months is exploration of risk. Are we willing to have this conversation? Do we want to see what that risk might look like, then make a decision on it? And perhaps we go through this process and we still end up back at the first process. I don't know, but this is what we're going to be talking about today, is whether we're interested in exploring any future growth in the community, knowing what we know now about our water system. The official community plan gives us a great framework, to develop our policy. It talks a lot about housing and water infrastructure. It was forward-looking in the sense that it understood that we had a water issue without having the data to back that up. It obviously also pointed to a need for all types of housing. So I think the OCP is a good structure for us to work on a policy. I think we're probably all getting tired of this table by now. I know I am. I've presented it probably 8 times at various meetings. What this tells us is where we are in terms of water. So I can draw your attention to the red circle. Now you can see our average day demand is 1,827 cubic meters a day, and our maximum day demand is 2,873 cubic meters a day. So there's a significant spread between those 2 ways of measuring demand. I'm going to ignore the treatment columns for today. Looking at our raw water capacity is 2,160 cubic meters. And so we can say, even though the square there is blocking it, based on maximum day demand, our raw water supply deficit is minus 713. Oops, sorry. The difference if we use average day demand is about plus 330 meters cubed. So just an explanation of what we're talking about as we go through this process. The other column or row that I'd like to speak with today is the 2033, and we haven't talked about that in previous meetings, and we focus on the current, and the current is actually a backcast. It's looking at 2021 data and back, and doesn't necessarily look forward. So as we go through this process, we're going to probably spend more time in the 2033 column than we will in the current column. And 2033 looks worse in terms of demand and supply than 2023 does. Part of that is one item that we would have to look to if we go back into this policy process. We'll be looking at that demand number. If we're going to restrict demand, that's automatically going to affect demand. And so we're going to have to go back and look at what that might be. But again, our raw water supply is also forecast to be less as we go forward with climate change and weather. And so that's going to be probably where we start with our policy, is 10 years out rather than what we're actually using today. I think I can leave that slide there. Again, we all know the reason we're having this conversation is we have a flow-through system. There is some data on flow-through systems. If we use our master municipal construction documents, and that's a group of as a documents that municipalities use for civil works, so designing, engineering. We use it for our subdivision development bylaw in Tofino. We can also adapt that. So our subdivision development bylaw, for example, doesn't use the MMCD rainfall curve because it's not accurate for Tofino. So we've inserted the Tofino rainfall curve, and we have a number of different areas, a different road design, for example, or a different type of street light than the MMCD does. So it's a set of standards. It's not legislation. And when we look at maximum day demand, it is addressed in the MMCD, and it's based on designing a new system. However, there is always a caveat to this because it's not legislation. If there's a unique situation that happens, you can consider other areas, which is where this conversation may go today, is a conversation about, do we want to use MDD, or do you want to use ADD, or do you want to use something in between? I think we've spoken about it already, but maximum day demand is theory. That's, it's like, we know that happens at demand, but we know that's not our demand every day. Average day is reality. We know what we've used over the last 10 years. We do record our creek flows. We do have metering, so we can be pretty confident in our average day demand. Risk tolerance, we're going to talk about whether we have any tolerance for any more risks, because it should be noted that we are, by definition, already in a risky situation in the sense that we're, in terms of MDD, we're already minus 713 cubic meters per day. So we're already in a situation of risk. The question is, are we willing to have a conversation about expanding that risk or just sitting where we are? Why even have this conversation? Why not just go off the most conservative number we have? It makes sense for a lot of reasons, but we do have a housing crisis. We have housing grants that we may be receiving or maybe applying for. We have an official community plan that sets up housing as one of our issues. So if those things weren't there, then maybe we are living in MDD and we're taking a more conservative approach because we are stewards of the water system. But I think it bears a conversation first. So the policy, once completed, will be a communication tool primarily. It'll allow people to know what Tofino's direction is in terms of future development. It's going to come back. We're going to develop options. Those options are going to come back to council and likely the community through an engagement process to get feedback. And then we're going to go through an evaluation that will likely be based in a risk tolerance exercise. And then decide on our preferred approach. I would like to move through this fairly quickly as we are dealing with this staff on a daily basis at this point, and comfortable right now in making these calls, but it would be really great to have some policy that we've all discussed out in the public and at a council table to provide some communication for the community. This conversation is an important one to have as we begin anew the zoning update. Taking care of this policy won't stop the work that we're doing on the zoning bylaw update, but it's my opinion as a planner that we don't make any big decisions until we get limits to growth done, which again, I hope to be done in a month or two from now. So work will continue on the zoning bylaw update, but we really want to know what we're doing with growth before we start dealing with zoning, which deals with growth. So this is one piece that needs to be in place before we make any large decisions on zoning. And finally, engagement. Today, we're introducing this idea to council and the community. And then following that, between now and when this finally comes back to council, we would look at a fairly comprehensive engagement process, including stakeholder meetings, open houses, and talk Tofino. Similarly, as we did for the water conservation plan, those wouldn't happen. These wouldn't happen sequentially. These would happen all at the same time. And in speaking with the manager of legislative services, we have the bandwidth in that department to undertake that in this time frame. And that's it. It's probably questions or comments, or it's probably should take conversation because again, we're in this process which is a little bit less formal than our normal council meetings.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate that. And, I'll look to council here. It is a committee of the whole format. So as Aaron pointed out, the ability to have more of a conversation. If there are questions, obviously, we have staff here to be able to work us through that. In terms of a format, in terms of how we might approach it, there was at the very beginning, you had talked about two main policy alternatives under consideration. And I may backtrack on that, thinking that there may be an opportunity at the beginning to think about that 30,000 foot level question, because the framework of this is certainly through a planning perspective, as it's the main component, the OCP and those other documents that we have, but it is not the only component that when we look to those limits to growth, so or limits to development, or however we want to phrase that. So I'll look to council and to the committee of the whole here to see if they want to address it specifically, those kind of policy alternatives, or more to start out with maybe that larger sort of 30,000 foot conversation, recognizing the constraints of time. But I think it would be beneficial to hear from council that overriding philosophical approach to this, and then maybe we can move into the more specific details, as you've indicated, the two main policy alternatives under consideration, where some of maybe the direction that you may be looking for as staff.
Yeah, exactly. So this is not a conversation about what the policy is going to look like. That's going to be work that we're going to do and come back to you. But I need some direction before we start that work about whether you need to do that work or how to do that work. And so should we be looking at some limited growth, or should we not? This is the conversation that I was hoping to have today. And then from there, we'll go back, do the work as sort of laid out in the timeline and the schedule, and come back to council and the community with options and a time for evaluation at that point. But great. I didn't know which way we were going to go.
I was just trying to give council a bit of a framework to start this discussion. So I'll start on this end with Ali. I don't know if you've got your thoughts formulated. I got 17 pages of notes, so I think I'll look at it again. See, you knew it. He knew I was going to pick up on the number. That's my lucky number. So Councillor Sawyer.
Thank you. Through the chair, I have a question just for the numbers for average and maximum day demands. And given that's fairly recent information, now that we're working on so much of our infrastructure, we have leaks identified and fixed. Are these numbers accurately reflecting sort of our current demands, or were they a year ago when we didn't know how many of our pipes were leaking?
It's the best information we have. It's what our water master plan is based on. Our pipes have always been leaking. We're always fixing them. So I'm confident in that data. That data isn't for example, the average day demand and in maximum demand isn't just what happened in 21 or 2020. It's an average of what has happened in that time period, which I think is 8 or 9 years. And so I'm confident that it's a good average number. Does it reflect every single year? It won't, because it's an average. But it's the information in that master plan is what we're using to make decisions on a daily basis. So I'm confident in those numbers and from that perspective.
And then a follow-up question to that: how frequently will we be looking at our demands as we progress through our conservation stages and going forward, thinking 10, 15, 20 years from now? Do we have a timeline of when we'll assess what our demands are, so we could look at what we're doing to address growth now and then adjust those decisions?
Yeah, not necessarily formally. So we measure, we track demand on a weekly basis already for the Q3 time period. We have all that data from metering anyway. So all that data lives with the District of Tofino. And so I guess I can say we're already doing that. I would hope that we would be reviewing a water master plan probably once every 10 years, and maybe an asset management plan really every 5 years. And so there'll be some kind of review of that bigger document. But in the meantime, I have the day-to-day or hour-to-hour or day-to-day information already. And so part of our practice when we're deciding whether to move to a different stage in the water conservation plan is we're looking at demand. So last week, we're looking at demand for what happened last year, and then looking at this average day demand to try to gauge that. So it's pretty much embedded in the work that we do already.
Thank you. Yeah, those questions were, framing definitely how we'll be looking at this, trying to understand how far reaching the decisions that our conversations are going to affect today with 5, 10 year framework is good to know.
I say 5 to 10 years because I don't think we'll be having any major solutions before that time period, subject to, a large magical grant coming out of the sky. So that's, I don't know if it's 10 or 20, but it's not next year for sure.
Okay, thank you.
We'll move to the other end of the table there. McMaster.
You consciously didn't make any mention of future developments at TFN might affect water demand.
I consciously didn't make any reference to any developments other than, so it wasn't just the Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. The Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation has a potential development of residential units. It also has a potential development of resort units. Woodsmere has 500 units. We have 3 potential apartments in the downtown core. We turned down recently a building permit for a large resort. So the development pressures don't go away, and depending on where they come from is not immaterial, but it's, like I don't know what to do about it other than that I know we need housing, and I know we have a water problem. So I consciously didn't bring it in because I didn't bring anybody else into this.
Yeah, my question was regarding headwaters and the increased demand and how that affects our risk, because by my calculations, it was about 30 cubic meters per day.
I'd have to go back to look at my notes.
That's what I came up with roughly, but so I'm just kind of wondering how that will affect our risk.
It's a great question. So I think as part of the policy process, one avenue we'll have to go down is looking at when this data came from, so 2021, and then looking forward in terms of building permits, what we've added since then to try to get a kind of a rough number of what the current demand might be based on that. And then basically convert that to a risk matrix. So risk for us is not going to be running out of water. Like that is not going to happen. We're not running out of water. Risk for us is how soon we go into a different stage. So are we going to go into stage 1 sooner? Are we going to go to stage 2 sooner? Are we going to go to stage 3 sooner? Are we in an emergency sooner? Because in the event that Tofino had a dry year like we did last year, and that we didn't have enough water to supply our tourism economy, we would protect our residents' water, and we would use the Emergency Act and the powers there to do so. So we wouldn't run out of water, but we would impact the economy and people's livelihoods significantly. And so that's, I think, and this is not a positive, that's probably the conversation we're going to have. How many units is going to get us into the next stage? How much sooner? I think. Again, this is not formalized. This is more just as we get through today's meeting, it'll be some more thinking about it. If the number is 30 cubic meters, and we think about our average day demand is 1,800, these round numbers, 1,800 cubic meters, that means 10% is 180. That means 1% is 18. And so headwaters, using those numbers, is about 2% increase. What does a 2% increase in our water use mean in terms of how many days before we go to? I don't know. I've been trying to do it. It's been about 2 days, a couple of weeks ago, just sketching out how you would actually determine that. I didn't quite get there. And so I'm spending a lot of time with our engineering team trying to figure out what that looks like in advance of presenting that risk matrix, that risk tolerance exercise to council at a future meeting.
What's your thoughts?
I don't have any additional questions. That's just someone asked similar to what I was going.
I got a couple comments. First of all, I'm not averse to a risk tolerant growth, just to let you know. But there's some issues that I think that I would like to see addressed in some data. And some of the issues, maybe the biggest issue I can see is using maximum daily demand, doing MDD to deny building permits, based on our existing zoning, et cetera, and latent zone rights. But then using an ADD to develop. So I think that would have to be, worked out, because we're using one to say no, and then we're using the other number to say yes to something else. And so I think that's.
So I think that's not like what's happening right now is I don't have any direction from council, and I have a report that recommends using MDD, and so that's what I'm using as my as my backup. This is a conversation about, do we want to use something different
I see.
in between?
I see.
Yeah.
I got you. Okay, so there you go. Okay, so, well, then looking ahead, if, in my opinion, if I think, okay, we should do some kind of limited growth based on housing, how will that then, like, the big question is, well, how then do you go back and say, well, we're using ADD now to go ahead and to find, fandangle some very limited housing growth, say infill housing, for instance, or something like that, where all at the same time using MDD to say, no, you can't have the resort. That's a difficult one.
So the way that I would break that up, and it would be in the policy, would be that we would do two things in policy. We would determine what uses that we were prepared to see move forward as a community. And so based on the OCP, based on even what the limited information I've heard so far, is that we're pretty clear that the only development we want to see is housing, right? And so the policy, the first step of the policy said the District of Tofino does not support X, Y, and Z, but it supports housing. The second part of the policy would say, we're going to accept a risk of X to develop 200, I'm just going to say numbers, but 200 units over the next 5 years. That's it. So we've basically defined what our risk is, like how many extra days we're going to get. And we've put a time limit on that and an amount so that we're not going to go over that. And so from there we count. So then it's not that we're not accepting more risk, but at least we've quantified it. And then the top part picks up that MDD conversation because we decide we're going to take that risk. And that's how we're going to make decisions. So the policy is so important in the sense that like it will guide all the things that we do. And the intent again is to have it rooted in the OCP. So we have that community, the community land use needs or community land use visions recognized through that. So.
And follow-up question. So that's great. So that's kind of what I figured, but I just wanted.
No, I appreciate it.
So the other thing that I have is if council does say, okay, we're gonna take some risk and do some housing development, focus on housing, based on whatever we decide, is that we know that we have a significant number of people living in trailers. They're illegal. We don't know that number. We know that there's, at least I do now, that there's a significant number of illegal tertiary suites that already exist, but we don't know that number. And so those things, like if council does go for some kind of, I think that we need to really understand exactly, get those real numbers because those are going to impact some of our decisions. If we do decide to do tertiary suites and some, well, what about the ones that already exist that are just illegal? What do we do with trailers? Are we going to, if we enforce, what does that do for water? Do we shift those people into some other housing or et cetera, like all those little, things. Basically we're getting, it's pushing us to dig down into very, very tight numbers and data. So that's my one.
I think it's a great comment. And again, just to all council and staff, I'm happy this is a conversation. Like these are, we're bringing this forward, but I'm not saying this is the exact right way to go. So I'm happy for these questions. And the trailer one is interesting. And so what I'm hearing, and I think I heard also from Councilwoman, is making sure our data is tight on this one before we get started. So let's have the good data. I have great data for water use, right? So we meter every single property in Tofino. So I can tell you exactly what our demand was last year in Q3 for the whole community. I can tell you what it is in all the R1 zones. I can tell you what it is in RA1. I can break it up however we want. It's a little bit of work, but not much. And that's a really good stand-in for what's actually happening on a property. We could also potentially go even further down that road and do some audits or, inspections, potentially, depending on what exactly we're looking for. But I can quite quickly figure out what the water demand is, and then we just make decisions based on there. In terms of uses like trailers, again, I think it is something we're going to have to look at some point. I'm just not sure if it's the limits to growth policy, which is based off permits and zoning and stuff, or if that's more of a zoning, like it may be more of a zoning conversation that we have when we get to the zoning bylaw about what uses are permitted. And if we are going to grow, making sure that is there an enforcement part of that as well? But I think we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
That's I think that's it for now.
Thank you. It's gonna be an interesting conversation.
I'll go to here. And then I'll because it's gonna take me a little bit to go through mine, so.
Could I have one more question?
Absolutely.
Sorry, before we move to some follow-up question. And the other, I just want to make it clear, like, because, you know, we're talking about a very limited time in the year. And so there's also the possibility of allowing development that won't impact our water use in that very finite time of year. Or allowing development that produces its own water or catches its own water. So there are other options, and I just want to just throw that out there right away, is that there, you know, we're talking about a very, very focused time and use, and there are some creative solutions outside of that, or options outside of that, that wouldn't actually affect our MDD or ADD in those, you know, in those 2 months or 3 months.
It's a great point, and definitely noted for inclusion, and that is that there will be things that we're not thinking about, or, you know, all opportunities for rainwater collection for certain properties or commercial retail uses that don't use water. Like there's definitely an opportunity there. I appreciate that.
That's what's fine.
I want to just ask a point for clarification through the chair. When we're talking about development allowed and housing development, and then restrictions, potential restrictions based on, you know, classification, are we looking at residential properties that operate Airbnbs the same as we're looking at resorts?
I'm not looking at any of those yet. So basically, we're talking about new development. And so I think the conversation about uses and about what I think is a downzoning conversation is something to have the zoning conversation, not in the limits to growth conversation, I think is how I would address that. If it's use based, probably there. The limits of growth policy is going to give us the direction that we need to make our decisions through the zoning process about future uses, because it's going to set out quite clearly what we're looking for and what we're not. And then from there, it will help inform that conversation, I think, that you're alluding to, if I understand correctly.
I'm just wanting to, yeah, thank you, understand all the details about what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so limits of growth is a policy. It's not a use change of use. So it's basically a reactive policy. If someone comes forward to us, I want to build something new or add something new, we're going to look at that policy first. For existing uses like resort zones or like short-term rental permissions, that will be a conversation we definitely have in zoning.
Yeah, and I think my concern would be if we're turning down, say, a resort development permit or building permit, but allowing a housing building permit where 60% of that housing use is going to be short-term rental. It's not dissimilar enough to, you know, warrant that distinction.
Yeah, I think it's what you're speaking to is what I'm dealing with right now on a daily basis and having to make that call. So what I need is a policy in place to tell me what council wants to do and would be a part of this conversation. So we say it's a short-term rental, but it is also housing. So someone's going to build a lot. We don't have a lot of lots in Tofino, and the amount of use that we're getting out of, say, a single family house is not going to tip us one way or the other at this point. So that's what I'm struggling with on a daily basis. So in subdivision, we're putting covenants on, we're reviewing every building permit to see what it is. And then for these bigger uses that obviously would impact our system. So a large resort could use up to 5 liters a second. That's a sixth of our current water. We just can't accept that. So it's a uncomfortable place for myself to be in right now, making that call. What I'm again looking forward to is that policy in place so that we can, that decision's made by a group, not just one person. So I will continue making the calls I'm making until we get this in place.
This is a tough one. Before I ever make a decision, if we ever did look at option one, did staff do some research into communities that have adopted an option one policy to see what the effects were?
Great question. That's where I started. So I looked in what was on the island or in even this part of the province. So we have Salt Spring Water District, Comox Regional District, Coast Valley Regional District, and Lanceville. they all have different versions of this, none of which are great in my opinion. No offense to anybody out there in the world, but and I've spoken to those policies or moratoriums, or whatever you want to call them, with our lawyers about, you know, how much we lean on that and sort of crafted how we're going to approach this based on that conversation that I had with them. I think I have done the research in terms of like picking the phone and talking to the staff people about how that affected the economy or how that affected building permits or construction. I did speak with someone who was semi-involved with the landfill situation, and they basically just stopped developing. There was just no more building permits, and I don't know what the outcome of that was. That's would maybe outside of our area, like how much money do I want to spend on going back 10 years to just having someone do an economic analysis of landfill 1997 to 2007 and 2007 on. We could, it's just not going to be a simple approach. I would say that the thing is that they work. Like in Salt Spring, you can only get a building permit if you can make your own water, because they have the water for you, and that's just the way it is. And sooner or later, everybody figures it out. I would imagine that it's a pretty big impact to construction industries, probably primarily in construction industries. Obviously, in terms of building revenue for us, but
you might want to look at Port Dover in Ontario,
yeah,
which is a tourist town, a bit like us. And I think they instituted a moratorium 1 or 2 years ago. I don't know if it's still in place, but
you know, the moratorium, you know, I'll look into it. I just, you know, what it was it focused on residential or commercial?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I think it was everything.
Okay.
And then Okotoks, Alberta, they were wanting more access to the Bow River, to take more water out. They instituted a moratorium, and that was probably in the early 90s. I don't know whether that's in place.
And I just want to say too, like, and I said at the beginning, but I think it bears repeating, that today is not about whether we're going to grow anymore. Today is just a decision about whether we should explore it. And so, as I said, we may end up back in option 1. Like it may come to council and we say, hey, here's the risk matrix we developed that we all agree on. Here's option A, no development. You know, option D is whatever that is, and then stuff in between. And we're going to say, are we comfortable as stewards of the water system moving forward with any of these? And the answer could come back to, no, we're conservative. We want to protect it. We like the MDD number. So I just want to make sure that before we get too far down, if we're going to grow or not, just a question of should we have the conversation? That's basically what today is meant to be.
Well, that's a good segue, and maybe I will I'll approach it because these have been very pragmatic questions, and I'm going to approach it from a slightly more philosophical approach at this point in time before I come back with some more. And the limits to growth policy, as you've indicated, is some tools that you'll be able to use for transparent and all those things that you listed off, and I understand that clearly. There are some present constraints to growth that has been identified clearly. Development growth through water, and one of the tools that we have to be able to do that is through zoning as a primary tool. But I do want to say that there are other aspects to growth and why we might want to be looking at those limits to or expansion, whatever it may be. And water is, of course, a huge one. It's a natural constraint, but there's also other factors such as quality of life for our communities, and where we want to look at the ability through our zoning process or other tools that are availability to look at. And I know that you've got a crunch time frame, and I think it's very ambitious to have this done in the time frame you're indicating. But this is an important conversation, and it's starting with water, of course, but I think there are some very fundamental questions about, as a community, what we want to see towards growth. And I know this is very specific in the tools that we have. It's also that quality of life also indicates, that there are other values that we place. And I look to the environment as one. So what is the carrying capacity? What is the natural carrying capacity? And are we exceeding that? We based a lot of our growth models on that 2%. I think that's, if I remember correctly now, it's about a 2%. That was a conservative growth estimate. And if you do 2% every year on top of our 2,500 plus people, and then 2% on top of that, ultimately, when do we end? And there is natural constraints to all of the systems that we have. And so I know this has come up in conversations before because we make a lot of land use decisions based on one guiding principle is the OCP and that land. But we have other documentations to help us guide and where we want to see this community go in terms of specifically growth. And I'll use quality of life as kind of one of those determining factors. You gave us two potential policy alternatives under consideration. And, you know, I see these as, you know, there's the short, medium, and the kind of those long-term visions. And this is very much in a short-term conversation that we're having. And so that larger conversation around limits to growth in that large 30,000 foot level, you know, that's been pushed to the side because we have these very real short-term constraints that has to be addressed. I know you get phone calls probably on a daily basis regarding this, and I absolutely understand we have to have that ability for you to make those concrete decisions instead of just, you know, it's all on your shoulders and you don't have a direction. And so I accept that. In the report, there was also, you know, it pointed to strategic focus, points to the need for pragmatic growth management and policies to limit some forms of growth until sufficient servicing and housing provided. So I see there is a bit of an expansion in terms of not just into the water. And I'm going to use servicing, not just in terms of water, but use servicing in terms of our school, our healthcare, our community policing, all of those variables that make this community what it is. So I think you gave me, I don't know if you were, but there was an ability there within that strategic focus to be able to look outside of just those water constraints. And I get it. And everyone's asked very pragmatic questions around that. It is, so, you know, that first discussion should be about how much growth is acceptable to maintain the quality of life, and not just as the humans, but everything else around us, recognizing those natural constraints to growth that we have here. So I did want to start from there for me personally, and just to see, because I do think there it is the fundamental question. You talked about how long we've been having this discussion, and it's been, you know, you've been a decade, and I know we've been having this, you and I have been having it for at least a decade specifically. So it is a critical conversation that's coming to the forefront because of our constraints with water.
Can I comment on that just really briefly?
Absolutely.
I'll forget if you go through your 17 pages.
Yeah, well, I've got 14.
Just the idea that for me as a planner, not a planner more, I do look to that document. The OCP has 7 principles, which includes reconciliation and the environment and social capacity, and resilience. And so that's, again, why we're sort of framing this policy within that, so that it does cover a broader area, even though my focus from infrastructure side is water. At this point, it's pretty specific. What the community's vision is and what is sustainable is that 2% growth. So when we presented the OCP in 2021, we said 2, 4, and 6. 2% was the residential growth. So people have babies, they want the kids to go to school, schools have to get bigger, people die. The human population is just getting bigger. And so 2% was intended to be what we could sustain long-term if we made certain land use decisions, such as focusing on the downtown core to focus where infrastructure is, building denser, taller buildings, because we have a limited land base. And if you want to have estate lots, you're into the forests and into the areas that we want to protect as natural areas. And so I just want to say, for me personally as a planner, and where I approach this so far, and again, I'm here to be directed, but it is based in those OCP principles and then those OCP growth targets. So I just want to say that's where I come from as a planner / infrastructure director working on this.
Yeah. And thank you, Aaron. And I know we've had this conversation before, and I respect that, because the OCP was a very intensive community-driven process, but it looked through one lens, generally speaking. I know we had broader parameters around that, but it doesn't take into consideration things like the capacity of our school system, the capacity of our healthcare system, the capacity of our community policing, the capacity of the environment to be able to sustain that. So those are some of the things. I know it's in there, but its broad focus and direction, I certainly understand, comes from.
Maybe we can have a coffee after.
Yeah, we will have a coffee. You know, we have in the past. So,
Yes.
but this is just where, you know, like in terms of where I'm coming from as a council member, not as a planner, not as someone who is a staff person that, you know, has very direct responsibilities within the District of Tofino. So that's how your framework, and I'm just explaining my framework for how I'm looking at the limits to growth in that policy that we need to formulate. So, yeah, so I just, maybe I'll just finish off because I mean, I think I've alluded to some of the aspects of how I will be approaching this. And because that water constraint is first and foremost, it is something that we will need to address. I just don't want to forget the fact that water is one component of what we need to be looking at. And through zoning, I note it as one of our best tools. And I'm very supportive of using zoning to be able to have this conversation and be able to direct us. So that's why, we got, as we go down fairly into the weeds in terms of maximum daily demand and those frameworks that you're going to need to make those decisions, absolutely. And where council is going to have that kind of data to support those critical decisions around that specific piece of infrastructure. I will start asking more pragmatic questions, but I did have to bring that foremost out to council because that is my driving factor. 30 years down what is Tofino going to look like?
I think it's a great question, and one sometimes I've played a thought experiment game with myself, and I said, let's just imagine we had all the water in the world that we had
And I
connected.
wrote that exactly, write it down.
Like, what are we basing our growth demands on there? Because we know this is a desirable place to live, and people want to be here, has a great economy, good schools, it's just great.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't know if we're in that conversation yet, because again, we don't have any water, but it is a really valuable conversation and a great way to shift perspective to think about what does this mean? Like, this is limits to growth thing definitely is focused on short-term water. That's it. Like, that's what we're here for. But it does bear thinking in the bigger conversations, you probably zoning or OCP about what happens if we had all the water in the world.
Well, that was my very first of the beginning of the 17 pages. By accessing an unlimited supply of water, what does that mean? And so that was how I started out the thought process in terms of this specific question around there.
Like limits to growth 2 or limits to growth 3.
Yeah, I just think that's a really good point, Councillor Stere had, and actually this just brings up a conversation I had with a prominent long-term resident the other day. And the resident said, what if we don't want to get more water? Say, why do we want to? And it really made me think, this is like it presupposes that that the community wants to go and get more water and pay for that, develop, to do that. And maybe that is in itself a bit of ahead of the actual game. We don't know that. It just reoccurred to me, and this sort of brings it up too, is that maybe this is in a sense we're out of water in a sense, with the MDT is a bit of a canary in the coal mine. Like maybe Councillor Stere is saying, hey, this is some time to not only do a limits to growth policy, but then to pause and be like, well, what does that mean in a greater sense? So I just want to say that's a pretty good point.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I wasn't presupposing that of anything. Basically, it's if the council decides it wants to stop growth, then it can go to its OCP and put a 0% growth in there and then deny all building permits. But that's a different conversation than what I was expecting to have, which is I'm looking at a limits to growth policy about water because that's my issue from that seat. If we have a bigger conversation about where the community wants to go, then Ms. Vermont and Mr. Thick at an OCP review time period. So I just wanted to say, just to make sure that I want to make sure that I'm open with council saying that I am only concentrating on water, short-term limits to growth for now.
And I respect that, and I'll look to our CAO, Nyla.
Thank you. Through the chair, just some point it triggered my finance brain when Mayor Law spoke about what the community desire would be if we were to take on a major infrastructure project like adding an additional water source. So the protections against that, in consideration of not making this discussion too large, would be the referendum or approval process we'd have to go through, likely to borrow money to carry out that project. So council can develop this policy. We may decide to do feasibility work on a particular project, but if the referendum comes back as a no, the community doesn't want to borrow this money, then that will be the opportunity for the community to comment.
Or you'll do like Ladysmith and just do an AAP process and
well, whichever avenue you choose in terms of approval, because both would be available to us, but that's very different than the wastewater treatment plant borrowing, where we were mandated to do so and we were exempt from going out to the community to ask.
And just a follow-up question, I was just the reason I was thinking about that in this context is that for me, it adds a gravity to this policy. Because I think, okay, you know, then I am starting to think, as Councillor Stere is starting to think, this policy is very directed, very, very, you know, needed right now. We have to have this, but also thinking, okay, I'm also thinking in the context of the future, how would this policy then, you know, then look in those conversations? And so I'm just letting you know that I'm just thinking about it in the context of the whole, and maybe that's jumping ahead of the game, but I just thought about it. Sort of adds gravity to the discussion. For me, yeah.
Thank you, and I'll just end and then we'll move on. I just you know, the ability of the committee of the whole is to have, we don't get the opportunity very often to have this kind of format, to have these larger conversations. We tend to get very focused in council with our agendas. So that's why I took this opportunity to have that. And I completely recognize what the intent and goals and purposes. I just thought this was an opportunity. I could swing in the big picture stuff. So thank you for that. And opportunity and I'll look to council now. Some of those questions that came out, and if I can summarize, some of the things were a little more data that was looked to, and I think you have excellent data at your disposal, as you've indicated. You make a lot of those decisions based on that day-to-day information in terms of our water monitoring, as an example. One of the fundamental questions I think you posed to us in terms of what we're looking at from a how are we going to take that much conservative model of the maximum daily demand, which we know has been pointed out that is very constrained time period at our highest uses with our lowest flows. And if we were to be pragmatic, and I think that's the word that was used in the approach, we may look at a very broader approach to development based on the fact that as I think Mayor Law was pointing out, that there may be some developments. And so by having a blanket policy of strict may not be in the best interest, because it doesn't give us that flexibility to be able to look at those projects individually. So I think, you know, and we'll maybe have more of a conversation about where we might want to look on those two specific policy alternatives, specific to water, and in the short term. And maybe I'll open it up to council again, another round, just to maybe, if it would be helpful, I think from a staff to maybe start maybe addressing those specific two policy alternatives. And I think that was one of them. When I read through the report, was one of the main considerations you were looking for. And, you know, and I'll just maybe read out the two main alternatives under consideration would restrict all growth under such time as the district addresses the water capacity deficit, denying building permits, et cetera, et cetera. This option would provide direction for all future development processes. That would be in the short term. That would be a quick question that I had. And then the second alternative was explore the possibilities of limited growth, and it's underscored related to housing, as was directed in there. A risk-based approach using a risk matrix that would include specific scenarios, number of units, existing demand, et cetera, et cetera. So so the one is very, very conservative and very I don't want to use the sledgehammer approach, which may be an accurate way. The other, it gives us more flexibility, more adaptability, but there may be some reasons council may have for thinking about that much more conservative approach to it. And I see benefits to both. So anyway,
yeah,
maybe I'll open it up again. Maybe we'll go inside here. We'll start with Councillor Sloman.
So I just kind of thought of two questions. Now we have some development proposals that currently have temporary use permits. Is there, if we went with a strict route, is there any way to extend a temporary use permit until we are out of the limits to growth policy? Because it kind of hog ties those.
Yeah, it depends on how long we're in the limits to growth policy for. And so just jumping back to Councillor Stere's comment, it is short term, but it's also long term. So the wording in the first one is until the district has a sufficient stuff. So that could be now, council decides it doesn't want to grow, it could be forever. So it was meant to be written that way, in the sense is I don't know when this will happen, if it will ever happen. So I would say that is the first one is short, medium, and long term, depending on additional decisions. So in terms of how far we can push the TUP out, it would depend on whether we're gonna get water or not. I think your comment brings up for me a note to remember in my brain. that we're gonna need to look at what's in the hopper right now for growth and factor that into there. So, so we're gonna have like, here's what's in the planning hopper for housing or TUPs that are currently there. That equates to X amount of cubic meters. Is that it, for what we have? Is that be part of that risk conversation? Do we want to do another 100 units at the top of that in the next 5 years? So it'd be things like TUPs going into the future, we would have directions. So if it was say TUP for, I don't know, something that used a lot of water that wasn't housing, it would probably say, we're just not gonna look at that as staff. We'll take the application, but our direction is to refuse that based on water. The existing, I'm not sure existing TUPs you're talking about.
I'm kind of thinking of, should I say it?
Sure.
I was kind of thinking of the crab-apple floral development, because it's housing currently.
It's how,
If we go risky, it would be losing housing.
so it's gonna be future stuff. So in the future, if Crab Apple or Anti Beach Resort or any of these other places that have TUPs for trailers specifically were to ask to go forward, I would look to the policy. If the policy says, hey, we're into it for housing, then maybe we look at it again. I can't predict what this policy is gonna look like because we haven't got to that process yet. But that's the process I would use. If our policy said no more development, then I would say no more development, we're not issuing a TUP because because of water, basically. So that's how the process would work. It's hard for me to guess now, depending on where we end up in terms of risk, where council ends up in terms of what type of housing they want to see. I mean, these are all the conversations we're going to have. Do we want to see more TUPs for trailers? Do we want to see only multifamily homes? Do we want to see large single family homes that don't have short-term rentals? Like, these are all the questions that we're going to have to wrestle with.
And if I may just comment towards that, at the end of the day, no matter what policy, council always has the ability to, staff may recommend that we don't issue a TUP. You always have the ability as council to have that discussion and debate, and you can make a decision based on that. Even though we have very strong guiding policies such as the OCP as our main one, if you decide as council decides that a recommendation, because they're going to base their recommendations on the policies that we have directed them and that they have gathered that input. But at the end of the day, if you're comfortable with issuing a TUP for whatever that is, and the rest of council, or at least four, agrees, then that is the law of the land, so to speak.
Troubling for staff, though.
Extremely, yeah, I recognize that for sure.
Well, my question was more like,
But just wanted to tell her what the option is.
Democracy.
Democracy.
my question was more like, if they've expired their TUPs, is there any way to extend those even though they maybe used all of them?
Oh, I know technically.
It depends on, I guess it'll depend on the policy. If the policy says no more development, no. Policy says yes to trailers, yes. And also then back into TUP legislation. So you can issue a TUP twice. So basically a 6 year, for a maximum of about 6 years. There are some ways that you can change things to get a new TUP. So some communities have TUPs that have sat for 25 years or 30 years for trailer parks. Something I, as a planner, don't necessarily agree with, but they have done it. So, it's a really tough question to ask. There's a bunch of factors, but the answer is maybe.
Further.
I do have one, but I don't know if I can.
Okay, yeah.
So I was wondering if in the more risky option, if there would be a way to balance, say we slowly start tackling the issue of the illegal trailers and suites. If we could then somehow work a permission in there that as we remove them, we could add more, like say units available to use water.
Definitely a possibility. Like, it would depend on how we decided what our limits to growth was. So we could do it based on units, right? So let's say 200 units, or we could do it based on cubic meters, 200 cubic meters, and then so then as uses came off the books, we could feed that back into there. So I think we could do it. I think it's a great question, and probably something for us to look into is when we come back to council, are we basing this on cubic meters, or are we basing it on units and or both maybe?
Go inside here as well. Councilor Thomas.
I think given the guiding principles of the OCP and our housing crisis, I would feel an obligation to explore the possibilities of limited growth for housing. And whether we end up going that way or not, if we don't look at that, then I would feel we're really letting the community down from that aspect. I think it would be great if there was a way to encourage things, maybe, like you mentioned, Salt Spring Island saying new developments that provide their own water. It could be, hey, we are only doing this, but the door is open for opportunities in that sort of sense. I know that it starts getting a little bit convoluted when we're like ABC, like the whole alphabet instead of just XYZ for options, but yeah, I think we need to take a bigger look at that before we go right into not offering anything. And I do feel like we have an obligation to explore water options, because whether we think Tofino doesn't need it or some community members think it doesn't, we also have that obligation to our First Nations communities that rely on us. And if there's an opportunity in some capacity to include them in those conversations when we get to those points, because our growth also affects their growth.
I think it's great points, and I think there is parts of me that want to see growth. People want to see houses for their children to live in the same community. So I think it's a good point, you know, to be broad. Something you said there, Councillor Thomas, just triggered something for me, just so I get it out there in the open meeting. But if it seems like we're sort of moving towards the second consideration, it feels like what it feels like in this meeting so far. Is council interested in any other uses that they would want to be seen in limits with? Are we interested in expanding commercial accommodation units or short-term rental units, or can staff for now focus on residential housing?
Can I just comment quickly, Aaron, just in terms of the, maybe I'll give an opportunity for the rest of council to mention, you know, the direction that feels most comfortable to them. We've heard certainly from Councillor Thomas, and I think I'm hearing an indication here. Maybe if we could just finish off with that, and then we'll come back to then the prioritization. So if we are moving in that number 2 direction, then we'll prioritize where we think as a separate line item. So that being said, Councillor Sawyer.
Yeah, I would definitely feel support through the OCP for the second option. However, there is a reason that I would want to see a risk managed growth as well. Because it's mostly when I'm thinking about businesses that are currently operating out of older buildings that are maybe not efficient or are, you know, non-compliant. And so we may have existing businesses that are looking to upgrade. And so I want to know that there's a way that if people can prove that they are going to be using the same amount of water, or that they would be managing their own water source, like, and just for example, a surf rental company that wants to actually build a proper building, and they can prove that they're using rainwater to wash their suits, and they have the designs for that. I'd like to see responsible growth within the community, especially for existing businesses. I wouldn't want to see them not be able to grow because, well, housing is huge. We only need that housing because of all the places that people want to work. And so if we're not seeing, you know, maybe future business growth, that's a different thing, but just existing businesses being able to upgrade and maintain their services is, and, you know, hospitals and schools and everything. You know, daycares, like those are building permits outside of housing, and we all agree that they're really important to our community. So even if it was the co-op expanding, that's outside of housing. But I do want to see responsible options for growth, but obviously with a clear focus on housing as well.
Easy, and that's an easy one to address within the policy. I think one other thing to say at this time is policy is what we're going to start with. We can, again, as Councillor Stere indicated, we can amend this policy at any time to address issues that we're not capturing. But I think it's a great point. I think that would be a relatively simple fix for us to, or not fix, but an addition to that policy. Thanks. That's what we meant.
Yeah, for me, both options are still on the table. Let's say this has been going on for 10 years. I think back for all the times I used to ask for the water master plan, and I used to get shut down by Bob McPherson every time I mentioned the word moratorium. So I'll mention it again. I'm not averse to a risk approach, but it is can be so subjective.
Yep.
Which worries me. And like I said initially, I have concerns with knowing that TFN wants to develop, and if we take a risk matrix approach, I would have a hard time saying, well, you guys can't develop, but we're going to carry on chipping away, doing a little bit here and a little bit there, but you guys can't do anything because we don't have enough water. And I think that'd be really tough for me, even for me to do.
I think it's a great point. Again, looking back into the OCP and principles, one of our major principles, and the first ones in the list, is reconciliation. And the idea that our water today comes from Mears Island, which is non-Tofino, which was protected for the trees, and but also provided us a water system and tourism economy. And so as much as we start talking about housing, there are other things, that we need to consider as well. And what I hope is this policy can get that broad so that we can maybe we can fine tune what exactly we're looking for. So I think it's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up.
It's a difficult point.
It's very difficult, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Councillor McMaster. Both options are still on the table for me. I feel really, I am a very cautious person, and to me, I see a lot of risk if we did have to shut down and declare a state of emergency, because that would affect everybody's economy financially. And so for me, I'm not really that comfortable with thinking about that. And yeah, but I mean, I understand we do need housing, and so I really am uncertain.
Yeah, and I think one way to think about it, and I mentioned earlier, is that I don't think this first consideration is going to fall out of this conversation. I think it's going to end up as an option anyways, because we could go through this, we could go through this, hopefully not a subjective one, like it'll be subjective for this group, but we can all get on the same page about what we think risk is and how we think we're going to measure it, and how we're going to talk about it, and then look at our 4 or 5 or 6 or 2 options and say this one or this one. Then it comes back to council for that decision. So I think we can accommodate that kind of thought in this process.
Thank you all.
I just want to go back to maybe one more thing. I know we're getting on, but Councillor Sawyer's point, I think, was very, very astute, that we have a new daycare being built right now. It's going to have to be staffed by people presumably who don't live here yet. New hospital development, which will have increased services, hopefully, also needs to be staffed by people who don't live here yet. And so I think we have I just think that's interesting, because we often get focused on business and housing related to business. I think that's just a good thing to think about. And I also just want to agree with comments about Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation, is that, for me, that with limited resources, that is something that we have to prioritize. So that's what I would like to see, for all the reasons that said. And I think we also have we have a buffer. We do have a lot of residential units that are being used commercially. There's a significant number of, hundreds of people, could be, I'm not saying it couldn't, it is there. There is a shift that's possible for at least some of those. We'll talk about, I'm sure, another time, but it is part of the conversation.
I really appreciate the comments from both Councillor and yourself, Mayor Law, about growth, because sometimes growth is a growth, right? Like, you might get a new hospital that might need 20 more people. We're going to need to find places for those folks to live. We're all living, because we're healthy, right? We're all living longer and want to stay in community longer. We may end up with seniors. Like, that's all growth related stuff. Like, it's not a 1-for-1 all the time. So the idea of having, and I don't know what that flexibility is, but some sort of flexibility to deal with that in the short term until we can figure out whether we want to go further, and if so, how we're going to do that, I think is really a valuable piece of this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much appreciate it. It touched on where I was going to be going with this, and in terms of the conversation around those two, and I'll segue right into those prioritizations in a second. I first out of the gate a few days ago, when I had lots of time to think about this and write all these notes, I was very supportive of a restrict all growth until such time. further reflection over that, it missed many of the variables that come up, and I think Councillor Sawyer and Mayor Law pointed out the two that I had written down in terms of those increasing capacities for those services, not just businesses, but those services that we rely on within the community. You guys touched on, of course, healthcare and daycare as two in our education system. So I'm leaning more towards that conversation because around those alternatives to a strong risk management policy around, and the term, I think it was Councillor Sawyer's, responsible growth, I think, and how we define responsible, of course, is the key. But it's an interesting way of looking at the conversation. What is responsible growth? Subjective approach to risk management matrix and the prioritization. So that's what we're leading into here. And if I were to, and there's a number of variables that are inherent. I think you were pointing that out as the wheels were going there. We may never be able to capture all of those variables within. That's why it has to be a living document. It has to be something that we can amend as those. We cannot anticipate every single variable. I just don't think that's realistic. But that being said, I think a much more subjective or flexible approach to than the big hammer. Although I will admit I am not opposed to the big hammer coming down until we've had a more reasonable. My leaning at this point is to that the second policy alternative that staff has brought forward to us, with the caveat that we have an ability to be flexible in that approach, and how staff come forward with that will be obviously a gargantuan task, but recognizing that we can't account for all the variables. We do recognize there are a number of issues, and housing, of course, comes first and foremost to mind as where that prioritization. And in through the OCP, you have given guidance, or the community has given guidance through that. And I did write those down in terms of, from a housing perspective, where we laid our priorities. And it started with that attainable housing and moved down from there to the very bottom, where commercial accommodation was at the very bottom of that spectrum. And that gives clear guidance, I think, from the community and to the council of the day that adopted the OCP within there. So we do have some foundational work that we can work from in terms of that prioritization from a housing perspective. But there are some tools that are going to be very difficult through zoning to have around how we can be more restrictive in those housing policies through zoning. And I think Councillor McMaster was alluding to a moratorium at one point. I remember when I first came on council, Councillor Bart proposed a moratorium on a specific zoning that did not meet with a lot of support, let's say, in the community in general. So these are some hard questions that come up, but I think going with that secondary approach through the OCP, we have guidance, and then we have a policy that hopefully we can craft flexible, and we know that can be amended. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll look to maybe, unless you have a comment there.
No, I just want to, again, I think I'm comfortable with that. So in terms of land uses that the community is interested in for the OCP, I think it's affordable housing, commercial retail, and then commercial accommodation. So I can take it from this conversation that that's how I can approach this process. So basically I'm focusing on housing.
Yeah, can I just have maybe just an expansion just for me, might go through with this housing is, I like the cubic meter approach. And if somebody's going to come forward with any kind of housing proposal that is very low on the water use, I think that would take priority over any other, like a higher water use housing. For instance, like, if somebody was to come like that, I know there's temporary use permits for trailers, residential trailers use very little water. So that's much different than somebody coming forward with larger, more water intense residential unit. And also, I think too, accommodation units, like I'm not averse to looking at campgrounds because I know they use very, very little water. Even though it's a commercial accommodation use. I mean, I recognize that there's still potential for an economic growth of some type. Even if TFN, they've got a lot of land, if they want to do something there, maybe resort is out of the question, but campgrounds use very, very little water, but they bring in significant numbers. So I think there's, maybe that's out of there, but maybe that's getting off topic, but I do think that there's potential with very low risk, low water, but maybe I'm out there.
I think the great thing is we're gonna have lots of these conversations, I think. 2 months and as we go through this process, like we're gonna be talking to council as council, we're gonna be talking to the community. And we're gonna be getting a bunch of different ideas and thoughts and ideas. At some point, we'll be back to council with your options. And then through all these meetings, we're gonna have time to say, you didn't think about this. Or what about that? Or my friend told me that, like we're gonna have this opportunity. So just to be at ease, this is just a start.
And we do have the chamber representative and Tourism Tofino. And I think about when we talk about economic stability as one conversation, it is in the best interest of business to understand what those constraints are, and having a more stable economic picture, larger picture, they can then plan for those kinds of issues. So if we're looking at bringing in new businesses, well, that probably is not to be sufficient, whether it be tourism accommodation or whatever, a restaurant that would support those heads and beds. At the same time, those that are here on the ground already, they can have some economic stability knowing that we have this type of policy in place and they can plan for that accordingly. So I think they're having representation here from both of our major tourism economy, as well as a number of other businesses that are represented through the chamber, have that conversation around economic stability, water, housing, two of the big ones. I don't know, I think maybe I'll just open up a little bit towards those sort of prioritization. I think we have a sense of that. We have that guiding document through the OCP. Do you need?
I think if this council comfortable with me, again, using that OCP framework, I'm comfortable using the priorities that we already have in the OCP as my guide. And then if we need to tweak that as we go down this process, through this process, then we can talk about it. So I'll start there and let's see where we get to.
Yeah, and I did write the OCP guiding principles down as the framework that we'll be using, and I don't know if it's worth reading those out, but there are 7 that we do have: reconciliation, affordable, attainable, and available housing, conservation of the natural environment, a huge one, authenticity, and I have a question mark around that.
Character.
But anyways, yeah,
It means character.
I do know. Yeah, I got character written with a question mark. Community well-being, once again, to be defined, and I put parks and trails and green spaces as part of that, but sustainable local economy. We just touched on that. Resilience, and we think about maybe climate change as well as some other potential factors economically as well as environment. And those are the top 7. Those are the 7 that we have as those guiding principles that you'll be using to framework this potential business growth policy. Is there anything else, and I'll look to the committee of the whole here, is there anything else, it doesn't have to be specific, could be in general, but this is maybe an opportunity. I'm looking in terms of our time, I think we're okay. I'm gonna look to staff over here. I think we're, yeah, getting nods. If there's anything else, generally speaking, around the limits to growth or limits to development, however we want to frame it, that the committee would like to bring forward now, this would be a good opportunity. Mayor Law.
Seeing as how it is a committee, I'm just gonna say, hey, is there anything that staff would like us to know?
He looked over his shoulder.
I've said so many things.
Yeah.
I know, Aaron.
Great. Sorry, did you put no? Okay. So I'm not seeing anyone jumping to the mic, and I think I've probably spoken enough. I'll look to see on our agenda here, where are we here, just to see if there is nothing done at this point, then we'll look to there is no unfinished business.
Chair Stere?
Yes.
Excuse me, there are 2 parts to the
Oh,
recommendation.
thank you.
On the agenda. The second part's not included on the agenda, but it's included in the report. So apologies for missing that, but in the report, the full recommendation includes what's on the agenda to receive for discussion, and that council provide direction to staff on the policy alternatives presented.
Okay, recommendation. So I've got on here that thank you for that. I was skipping over everything because there is a recommendation there. And the first one should be straightforward in terms of the limits to growth policy process outlined in the May 23rd, 2024 report to committee of the whole be received for discussion.
So,
And
I don't know.
and that council, yeah, and that
We can
council.
do them separately. That's not a problem.
Okay,
Go ahead with the first one.
go ahead with first. Thank you, Councilor McMaster, seconded. All those in favor? Seeing none, opposed, motion carried. And then the second one, that council provide direction to staff on the policy alternatives presented.
So we need to add a little bit more.
Yes.
To that, if council's
And-
comfortable with staff exploring, continuing to explore both policy directives. But having a look at the second alternative, we could maybe include some language around that just for staff's clarity.
So to further that staff be directed to explore both policy alternatives with an emphasis on policy alternative 2 with that.
Sure, that's fine.
Is that I'm looking to Keegan, is that you've got enough there? Great. I'll first thank you, Councillor Stoneman, for seconding. All those in favor? Seeing none, opposed, motion carried. Great. Now I'll talk about unfinished business, which there was some unfinished business. Thanks for bringing that point up. Question period now. Keegan, was there anybody online today?
Yes, Chair Stere. So I will open a call for all folks online and in the gallery here for question period. If you wish to make a question to council, you may do so by raising your hand by the Zoom function on Zoom and stating your name, your address, and the agenda item you wish to speak to. So the call will be going once, going twice, going 3 times. There are no current questions. Councilor.
I'll look to the gallery if there was any questions from those in attendance in person here. Not seeing anyone jumping up, but I'll give them a second to contemplate. Seeing none, we can move on to the closed session here, and I'll read from the chair that the recommendation that the meeting be closed to the public pursuant to sections 91A, CK of the Community Charter to discuss matters relating to A, personal information about an identifiable individual who holds or is being considered for position as an officer, employee, or agent of the municipality or another position appointed by the municipality. C, labor relations or other employee relations. And K, negotiations and related discussions respecting the proposed provision of a municipal service that are at their preliminary stages and that in the view of the council could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality if they were held in public.
Second.
Thank you, Councillor McMaster. All those in favor? Motion carried. Let's take a 5 minutes bio break, as we now call it. And we'll reconvene at 11:30.